Welcome to the Crazy Chicken People podcast. If you're crazy about chickens, then you're in the right place. Hey, what's going on, chicken people? Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Crazy Chicken People podcast, where today we're strapping on our rubber boots and jumping into the messy and sometimes stinky topic of muddy chicken runs. From short-term solutions to drying out the slop and getting rid of the stink, to long-term fixes to make sure that your chicken paradise doesn't get flooded out every year, we'll discuss some of the easy and the more difficult options for keeping your chickens high and dry. But before we get into the solutions, it is important that we also talk about some of the health risks that a muddy run can present to your flock. Just like us and most other animals that live on land, chickens do prefer to live on dry ground where they can peck and scratch, dig up bugs, and toss some dust around. But during the rainy season, as it starts to get wet, these things become more difficult to do if that run is prone to holding water. When the run becomes saturated and your dust bath starts turning into a mud hole, your chickens are left spending their time just trying to stay dry instead of enjoying that space that you've created for them. But they aren't just losing out on some of those things they enjoy, they're also potentially being exposed to mold, fungus, bacteria, and end up living in a space that's become a better home for parasites than it is for chickens, since that moist ground is the perfect place for worm eggs to incubate. But worms aren't the only enemy that can be lurking in that mud. The mold and fungus that can start to develop as poop or any feed or grains that are in the ground start to ferment can lead to respiratory issues for your chickens and can turn into one of the nastiest smells you've had the displeasure of taking in. A minor scratch your bird got in a clean environment that would otherwise heal quickly is now constantly exposed to harmful bacteria. So not only can your chickens be more prone to contracting infections like bumblefoot, it's also going to be much more difficult to treat these issues in such an environment. Considering the fact that a muddy run makes it more difficult to keep their coop clean, can cause mud and bacteria to get tracked into nesting boxes, and can even cause injuries to us, this is where I admit to having recently taken a fall in some mud just outside of our barn, and is why we should take a look at the different ways that we can help keep that run as clean and dry as possible. And while some of the things I'll suggest should really start when you first plan and build your run, we'll definitely hit on some things that you can do right now to dry things out, and almost everything can still be done even if your coop and run are established. They might just be a little bit harder to do, and maybe projects that you plan for later on this spring. So to start off, the first best thing you can do to get rid of all that slop is really to keep your run from getting flooded out in the first place. If you're able to put a solid roof over the run, not only is that going to help with keeping predators out, but will also keep direct sun off them in the summertime and prevent most of that rain from getting in there as well. Now, you still might have to contend with rain that blows in from the side or even just flowing into your run, depending on the terrain and how water drains across your chicken yard. So if you do have a roof over your run, but you're still having a problem with the rain blowing in, something as simple as a tarp across that side that the wind blows on will really help a lot. And there's a number of things you can do to create this temporary wall. I've even seen people use boat wrap plastic around the coop and the run in areas where winters are extreme. And if you don't have a solid roof, you can even use something like this over the top of it to deflect the rain as well. It may not look pretty, but keep in mind it's just temporary, and still a better option than walking through mud soup. Now, if you do use a tarp as temporary roofing, it's a good idea to run that at a really sharp angle so that the rain immediately sheds off of it. I have seen tarps draped over the top in the past where it was ran too flat and really just ended up catching a lot of water until it built up and got too heavy for the tarp to hold, just ended up collapsing and all that water got in anyways. If you get a combination of heavy rain or snow and extreme cold to the point you need to close in the majority of their space, just make sure that you leave plenty of open area to let the air blow through there and keep things really well ventilated. I've done some things like this in our biggest chicken run where we don't have a solid roof over it. I actually just used some old plastic roof panels that came off of our barn I was able to hang a few of those next to each other in such a way that it catches a good amount of the rain and sheds it right out to the edge of the run where it then just flows into the pasture. I use this area beneath them to keep their feeders and their water bucket, their dust bath, all the things that I don't want getting wet, but the rest of that space is wide open. And to make things even more difficult, this run and our barn are all at the bottom of a hill that gets runoff from not just our property, but about half the road that leads to our house. When it rains hard or for days on end, we've got a steady flow of water that comes down and threatens to really flood out the entire area. It's taken quite a bit of ditch digging or building up of berms to direct the water away from these structures. But even with that, I saw that last year, way too much water was still getting into this flat space where the run is. And even though I was able to divert a lot of it away, because the ground was so saturated, the run was still getting way too wet. I realized that the only way I was going to be able to keep that from happening was to improve the drainage and to raise the elevation of that run. These things are way easier to do when you're building a run, but still are achievable afterwards. I started off digging a ditch right through the center of the run, and then I filled that all with crushed rock. This allows any of the standing water that might build up to end up leaching out of there. I probably should have put some sort of a perforated pipe in there, but I was trying to keep the cost down on this. Fortunately, the gravel seems to be holding up and working just fine. After that, I dumped a few yards of soil that we had dug out of our backyard in there to start building the area up. Now, luckily for me, the ground out here has a lot of rock and sand in it, so it naturally drains and compacts really well. I would avoid using a topsoil, the type of dirt you would put down if you were putting in a new lawn. It's just way too soft, it really doesn't compact, and is just going to get really sloppy when it gets wet. If I had planned this out a little bit better, I would have started by putting a few inches of crushed rock down across the entire chicken run, maybe even a couple of French drains in there, and then some well-compacted soil and topping dirt over that. But for the most part, what I did ended up working out. Now, if for whatever reason all of that is just not an option for you, you can still create some elevated areas in the run and through the high traffic areas so that your flock can avoid the mud or the standing water. You can take some really good compactable soil and maybe just build a few small hills in there, some pavers or even some logs and rocks, anything that gets them up off of that low, saturated ground, and they can kind of hop around on this and at least always have a good place to stand that's dry. Now, this may not be perfect or protect the entire run, but it can be an easy temporary fix to at least get you through the winter. You can also try to divert any groundwater that may flow towards your coop with some sandbags or with some wattle. Wattle being the kind you see on the side of the highways, not on your chicken's cheeks. These things will help your run from getting really saturated and sloppy, but unless you're covered by a really solid roof and protected on all sides, we're still going to get some moisture in there. At least to the point there's still going to be some muddy feet and tracking moisture back into the coop. So let's talk about a few things you can do to help with that, and if whatever you choose to cover the ground most of the year is still the right choice during the rainy season. In a previous episode, I'd mentioned that I'd been trying to convert some of our coops over to sand on the ground rather than shavings or straw, and that I wanted to do the same thing in the runs, but I just haven't been able to get to that yet. So for the most part, I'm still putting down pine shavings, which work great when it's dry, but I'm finding maybe one of the worst options when things start getting wet. In fact, I'm really wishing that I had just started dumping sand in there after building up the base of the run, because it'd probably be a whole lot easier to keep things dry now. I think the combination of sand over a well-compacted subbase made up of a soil that allows for drainage is probably the best scenario for keeping the surface dry. Even after a heavy rain, as long as the water is able to drain away from that run, the top inch or two of that sand usually dries up pretty quick once it gets some sun and a little breeze going over it. But I'm finding that these shavings definitely do not. They actually seem to hold the moisture in as they get packed down by the chickens walking over them and really turn into a thick, heavy layer that can be difficult to rake up and keep the poop and the organic matter trapped in this soggy bed of nastiness. They do a decent job of keeping the mud off the chickens' feet, which is good, but the smell that starts to build up as things start to break down in there is pretty gross. And if it rains right after you cleaned out that run and dropped a few bags of fresh shavings down, it kind of feels like those shavings you paid for just went to waste, since they're probably going to stay wet until the next time you change them again. I know straw is another very commonly used ground cover in chicken coops, and while it's not my personal favorite, it is fairly effective in dry weather. In the wet weather, however, not as great. If you do have mud in the run, tossing a bunch of straw over it can help create a cleaner walk path and keep some of the mud out of your coop for a little while, but it seems to get mashed down really quickly and starts to mix in with the mud, creating a thick, heavy mat that is also very hard to clean. It also doesn't really absorb much of that moisture, and like the shavings, tends to create a layer over the top of the ground that actually traps that wetness in instead of helping it dry out. Now, if you're willing to change them out as soon as things get wet, you can get by using straw or shavings, assuming that you don't have a bunch of standing water or slop in there. But that could mean having to clean out your run several times a week in the winter, or even daily if you get the kind of rain that we had here the last few years. And going through quite a bit of new bedding, which can start to get a little costly. And the truth is, when it's raining every day or close to it, it's going to get a little messy in there. And it really won't matter what you put on the ground if the water isn't able to drain out, which is why proper sloping, a subbase made of soil that drains well, and high points that your chickens can get up on are all super important when it comes to keeping your run and your chickens' feet dry. But there are a couple items that I'm familiar with that can help keep things a little bit drier and from getting too stinky. Pine bedding pellets are probably the best, at least in my opinion. They're designed to do exactly what we're talking about, absorbing the moisture and reducing the smell in animal pens. Now, they won't dry up a full puddle of water or soupy mud or anything like that, but they will do a great job at keeping the surface fairly dry between storms. I think that because they easily get kicked all over the place and kind of mixed up as the chickens move around and over them, they don't tend to get matted down like the shavings and the straw do. And because they expand a little bit when they get wet, it allows them to actually dry out again and continue to pull water off the ground. They eventually break down into like a sawdust and just kind of mix back into the dirt, although I would recommend raking up as much as you can once it's used up, just like you would with any other litter. Now, they're not exactly cheap. I think they run about the same as a bag of shavings, but you should get a lot better use out of them than you would the shavings, and I think they'll last a little bit longer too. And they also help with the smell, which is really nice. Another good option for this time of year is the wood chips that you'll see used for like a playground area or garden mulch. Of course, you'll not want to use anything that's had color added to it, like you see in some garden mulches, just natural, untreated products. But these will actually help absorb a lot of that water off the ground and then help it to evaporate a lot quicker than it does just sitting in dirt. Like the pellets, they do tend to get kicked around and mixed up, which will allow your chickens to be able to dig and scratch around in there the way they like to do. They definitely won't get matted down like the shavings or straw, although they can start to get pressed into the mud if it is getting a little bit too soft. And while they do last a good bit longer than the bedding pellets will, they don't really do much for the smell. Both of these are really good options for helping to keep that mud down in your runs this type of year, but definitely work best when combined with a surface that drains well and is sloped to shed water out of your chicken space. One last thing I wanted to mention, and this might seem a little bit cheesy. I wasn't having a huge issue with the mud so far this year. There was a few spots where I needed to bring the ground up a little bit, and I added some more fill dirt here and there, or made some tweaks to some of the roofing. But I did notice that the girls were tracking some mud into their nesting boxes still, and I was seeing that their eggs were not as clean as they usually are. And as I was walking into the shop one day, I stopped to wipe the mud off my shoes on this beat up old welcome mat that I had tossed out there. And I thought, it would sure be nice if my chickens would wipe their feet off before going into their coop. And then it kind of hit me, why not put a welcome mat down for them too? But not just flat on the ground. I figured this would just end up getting covered in dirt and mud again. So I kind of built like a little ramp, or almost more like a little bridge, to put this on top of. And my goofy idea there was that as they walk up or down that bridge that's got this mat over it, maybe they slip a little bit or their feet kind of wipe on that thing as they're moving around. And it does end up hopefully absorbing some of that dirt, knocking some of the mud clumps off their feet, and should help keep the coop a little bit cleaner. I've noticed a little bit of a difference inside the nesting boxes, though I know some of them are avoiding it, at least as much as they can. Now, I don't know that I'd recommend going out and buying one just for this, But if you've got something laying around, make sure that it's not made up of anything that they can really start to tear apart. I can imagine if some of those like nylon strings or anything start coming loose, they might start tugging and pulling at it, thinking they can eat it. Definitely don't want that. This one I found is almost solid rubber, but has some sort of like a synthetic felt over the top of it. I'm not even sure what to call it, but it does seem to knock a little bit of the dirt off of their feet. And it's definitely not something that they're going to be able to tear apart and accidentally ingest any of. We'll see how well that ends up working out for me in the long run. I don't know if it's actually working or I just want to think it's working, but I just felt like I had to try something there. I don't know. Sometimes I get these ideas and I just give it a shot and see what happens. Okay, guys, that's everything I've got for you on muddy chicken runs this week. I hope that some of that helps you or gives you some ideas for things you can do around your coop. Want to thank everybody that's been sending me pictures of their chickens lately. Super cool. Totally appreciate it and hope to see more of them. You guys all have a great week, and I'll talk to you later.